I want to begin by separating two questions that are very often run together in discussions of this conflict. The first question is historical and political. What actually happened in Palestine in the 20th century, and what moral judgments should we draw from it? The second question is methodological. Does the theoretical framework most commonly deployed to answer that first question, the settler colonial paradigm, behave like a healthy explanatory framework, or like one that is failing by its own field standards? Theoretical frameworks are not neutral instruments. When a framework fails in a specific way that I'm going to describe today, not by being wrong about the facts, but by making itself structurally incapable of being wrong, the consequences extend well beyond the seminar room. A framework that cannot be falsified cannot be corrected, and a framework that cannot be corrected will go on classifying things, events, people in ways that serve its predetermined conclusions regardless of what those things actually are. That logical structure in which classification is prior to and immune from evidence is not merely a methodological failure, although it certainly is that. Its characteristic thought pattern is one of authoritarian unreason. I'm not suggesting that those who deploy the paradigm are authoritarians. I'm suggesting that the scholarly framework, when it migrates into political and activist discourse and begins to classify people rather than analyze structures, the unfalsifiability that was a flaw in the seminar room becomes something considerably more dangerous outside it. I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions about what follows from that. For now, let me introduce the tools. My argument is directed entirely at the methodological question. I'm not going to try and adjudicate the history. What I'm going to argue is that the settler colonial framework, as it's actually deployed in the dominant scholarly and activist literature, displays a specific diagnosable set of symptoms that philosophers of science associate with a research program in decline. To make the argument, I'm going to borrow from Imre Lakatosh's philosophy of science and from Giovanni Sartori's political methodology. Neither framework is difficult, and I'll explain both before applying them. The hardcore and the protective belt. Imre Lakatosh, writing in the 1960s and 70s, was dissatisfied with the standard picture of science as a process of conjecture and refutation, where a single experiment, if decisive, can falsify a theory and force its abandonment. Real science, Lakatosh argued, doesn't work like that. Scientists don't abandon their theoretical commitments the moment an anomaly appears. Instead, they work within research programs, long-running collective enterprises, organized around a hard core of theoretical commitments that the community treats as non-negotiable, surrounded by a protective belt of auxiliary hypotheses that can be revised, patched, or extended as new evidence comes in. When an anomaly threatens the hardcore, the response is not to abandon it, but to adjust the belt. And this is not a sign of intellectual dishonesty. It's normal, rational scientific practice. The question is, what kinds of adjustments are being made? And the diagnostic I use, and Lakatosh uses, is the distinction between what is progressive and what is degenerating. Lakatosh's key distinction is between a progressive problem shift and a degenerating one. Consider the case of Newtonian mechanics confronted with the anomalous orbit of Uranus. Rather than abandoning Newton, astronomers added an auxiliary hypothesis. There must be an undiscovered planet exercising gravitational influence. So the hypothesis predicted the position of Neptune, a novel, independently testable claim, and Neptune was subsequently found. The protective belt of the research program had been adjusted in a way that generated new content, new predictions, new corroboration. That is a progressive problem shift. Contrast this with the invention of Vulcan to explain anomalies in Mercury's orbit. Vulcan was posited, searched for, and never found. The auxiliary hypothesis existed solely to absorb the anomaly and protect the Newtonian core. It generated no independently confirmed novel content. That is a degenerating problem shift. The general diagnostic then is this. A program is degenerating when the adjustments made to its protective belt are A, not independently testable, B, do not predict new facts subsequently corroborated, and C, exist solely to rescue the hardcore from anomalies rather than to risk new claims. An infinitely elastic belt is the sign of a theory that has stopped doing genuine explanatory work. It has become compatible with anything that could happen, and a theory that is compatible with anything explains nothing. Some of you can probably see where the argument is going, but before I do the application part, I'm going to turn to the second tool, which is Giovanni Sartori's analysis of something he calls conceptual stretching. Sartori was concerned with a recurring pathology in comparative political science. What happens when a concept developed to explain and describe one set of cases is expanded and extended to cover many more? His image is the ladder of abstraction. At the bottom of the ladder, a concept has what he calls high intension, which means it has many defining attributes, and correspondingly low extension. It applies to a limited range of cases, but it applies precisely and discriminatingly. As you climb the ladder, you shed attributes to cover more cases. At the top, you have a concept with very low intension and very high extension. It applies almost everywhere, but it no longer discriminates between things that are genuinely different. Sartori called the product of climbing the ladder of abstraction too far a cat-dog. A category that is formally unified but substantively incoherent, because it has absorbed cases that share the label, but not the structural features that make the label analytically useful. His prescription was simple. Hold the defining attributes fixed and let the concept's range of application be a finding, not a decision. The moment you find yourself quietly dropping an attribute to make a hard case fit, you're not discovering that the case belongs in the category. You're deciding that it does, and then you're dressing up the decision as if it were a discovery. And when the motivation for that decision is not empirical, but moral or political, when a case is admitted to the category because it carries the right normative charge, not because it satisfies the criteria, the concept has ceased to be an analytical tool and it's become a political one. Let's do the application now. The hardcore in Lakatos's approach is this. Treat the settler colonial reading of Zionism as a research program in Lakatos's sense. It's hardcore, drawn primarily from the work of Patrick Wolfe and Lorenzo Veracini, consists of three commitments. First, that the relevant unit of analysis is structure, not event. Settler colonialism is a structure, not an event, in Wolfe's foundational formulation. Second, that the organizing logic of that structure is the elimination of the native population, whether through assimilation, expulsion, or extermination. Third, that the process involves an imported sovereignty claim displacing a prior one, typically backed by an external metropole. So that's the core of the research program of settler colonial studies. Now, let's look at some of the anomalies that arise when that research program is applied to Zionism. First of all, anomaly one, the absent metropole. classical settler colonialism, Australia, Algeria, Kenya, South Africa, has ascending state that authorizes funds and often directs settlement. The British Crown, the French Republic, these are institutional entities with recognizable legal and financial relationships to their settler populations. Zionism had no such metropole. The British mandate was not an authorizing metropole, but an obstructing power. The 1939 White Paper severely restricted Jewish immigration at precisely the moment European Jews most needed refuge. And the post-war British Navy intercepted ships carrying Holocaust survivors attempting to reach Palestine. So that's the anomaly. What does the program do? It makes an absorption move, and that absorption move is to redefine the metropole functionally rather than institutionally. International Jewish Capital, the World Zionist Organization, or the West generally becomes the metropole. But notice what has happened. Metropole has been transformed from a specific, falsifying institutional relation, one you could in principle identify or fail to identify, into a diffuse cultural and financial abstraction. No conceivable fact about the organizational structure of early Zionism could now count against the claim. That's the first Lakatoshian warning signal. Anomaly number 2, competing indigeneity. In standard settler colonial cases, the settler population arrives carrying a foreign imperial identity, British in Kenya, Dutch in South Africa. The direction of indigeneity is unambiguous. The case of Jewish immigration to Palestine is structurally different. The arriving population had a documented, if attenuated, continuous presence in the territory, a textual and a liturgical claim to it going back millennia, and crucially, had itself been subjected to genocidal persecution in the countries from which it was fleeing. Many of the settlers were not agents of empire, but refugees from it. Now look at the absorption move that the paradigm does. It is to classify any indigeneity claim by an arriving population as simply a colonial alibi, by definition, not as an empirical claim to be weighed, but as a symptom of settler colonial ideology. This is the most troubling of the protective belt adjustments, because it makes the theory self-sealing. No historical evidence about the character of Jewish presence in the land, no evidence about the nature of the persecution being fled, can enter the analysis. Why not? Because the theory has pre-classified such evidence as simply colonial discourse. An empirical question has been resolved by definitional fiat. I'll move through the remaining 3 anomalies quickly because I think that you've got the pattern of it. Anomaly 3, demographic composition. Roughly half of Israeli Jews descend from populations expelled from the Middle East and North African states. Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews do not form a European metropole. The absorption move generalizes the structure to simply label as settlers any arriving population, regardless of the circumstances of its origin. So the structural claim holds regardless of the democratic composition. And if that's so, it's compatible with any fact about population whatsoever. A claim compatible with any fact is not an empirical claim. War typology mismatch. The 1948, 1967, and 1973 wars were conducted by and against recognized state and proto-state actors, with interstate alliances, conventional military engagements, and formal armistice agreements. This is the typology of national conflict, not of the asymmetric pacification campaigns, the frontier wars, the Indian wars that characterize the settler indigenous paradigm. The absorption move in settler colonial studies reframes interstate war as elimination logic operating at a regional scale, again, without generating any prediction that the reframing could fail. In short, you can't win with the paradigm. You ask the paradigm, what would it take to demonstrate that it is wrong about something? And I wonder what the answer would be. The fifth and last anomaly that I want to deal with is the elimination thesis. I've said there that it underperforms, and I want it to be clear that what I mean here is the concept is underperforming. It's not doing the work that it ought to be doing. Wolff's thesis predicts that the structure drives towards elimination through assimilation, expulsion, or extermination of the national population. The Palestinian Arab population has in fact grown substantially under Israeli administration since 1967, rather than being eliminated. Again, what is the absorption move that the paradigm makes? It relabels this as elimination delayed, or slow motion ethnic cleansing. But a thesis to which elimination may be indefinitely delayed, with population growth counted as evidence of eliminatory intent, rather than counting against it, has made itself immune to falsification by any demographic trajectory. That's not a structural insight, it's a logical error. 5 anomalies, 5 absorption moves, none of which generates a new independently testable prediction. Each one functions solely to protect the hardcore of the paradigm. By Lakatosh's criteria, you're looking at a degenerating research program. Briefly applying Sartori, the ladder of abstraction, Sartori's ladder tells the same story from a different angle. We'll get to that. The original low-altitude definition of settler colonialism developed by Wolff and Veracini carries a rich set of defining attributes: a settler population seeking permanent structural replacement of the indigenous population, a logic of elimination as the organizing drive, not an incidental outcome, an external metropole with a recognizable institutional relationship to the settlers, settlers who seek to supersede rather than join or assimilate into an existing polity, land tenure mechanisms, terra nullius doctrines, reservation systems as the structural expression of the eliminatory logic. Reaching the conclusion that Zionism fits this definition requires climbing the ladder at every single attribute. Metropole becomes optional or metaphorical. Permanent replacement softens into demographic change. The indigeneity question, that's foreclosed by definition. The land tenure mechanism generalizes into any asymmetric conflict outcome, including conventional war. By the time you've climbed all of those steps, ask Sartori's question, what no longer fits? If logic of elimination now covers any successful nation-building project born of conflict and demographic displacement, it should also cover the Greco-Turkish population exchange of 1923, the post-1945 expulsion of 12 million Germans from Eastern Europe, and the mass demographic transformations of partition-era India and Pakistan. But none of those are classified as settler colonial in the literature. The asymmetry, applying the concept where it carries moral condemnatory force and withholding it from formally analogous cases where it does not, is the definitive signature of a concept being used as a political instrument rather than an analytical one. The concept is no longer doing the work of discrimination. It's doing the work of denunciation. I want to turn briefly to directional error and then finish with a polemical flourish. There's a principle in philosophy of science stated clearly by Popper and implicit in Lakatosh about the relationship between error and intent. Random errors distribute randomly. They correct in both directions, sometimes towards a conclusion and sometimes away from it. Systematic errors that consistently correct in the same direction, always towards the same conclusion, always rescuing the same verdict, license a different inference. They suggest that something other than disinterested inquiry is driving the analytical choices. Run through the 5 absorption-moved catalog today and ask, do they distribute randomly? Does any one of them revise the conclusion toward greater complexity, toward a verdict more favorable to the Zionist case, towards an outcome that problematizes rather than confirms the framework's central charge? Not one. Every adjustment, metaphorical metropole, the definitional closure of indigeneity, the incorporation of Mizrahi Jews, the reframing of interstate wars, the delayed elimination rescue, moves in a single direction. All of them protect the conclusion, none of them risk it. I said I would end this section with a polemical flourish that's not necessary to the argument, but which I think is food for thought. In the judgment of Irving versus Lipstadt, the libel case in which David Irving sued Deborah Lipstadt for calling him a Holocaust denier, Mr. Justice Gray noted in his judgment that Irving's historiographical errors did not distribute randomly. They all pointed in the same direction. And that consistent directionality, the judge concluded, was itself evidence supporting the inference that the errors were not inadvertent. I leave it for you to consider whether that principle has any application beyond the case that is stated. And I will close with a quote from Hannah Arendt, which will be familiar to many of you. And say this. Her point was that the danger of consistent substitution of falsehood for factual truth is not simply that the lie comes to be believed, it's something more fundamental. The result, she argues, is that the very faculty by which we orient ourselves in reality, the capacity to distinguish truth from falsehood, is itself destroyed. And she added that consistent lying, in her phrase, pulls the ground from under our feet and provides no other ground on which to stand. I don't accuse anyone of deliberate lying, but to a research program that has become structurally unable to be wrong, a framework that absorbs every anomaly, forecloses every counter-evidence by definitional fiat, and consistently moves in one direction, regardless of what the evidence shows, that does something analogous to what Arendt describes. And I'm about to finish. It doesn't produce a lie, not exactly, but it produces something that in some ways is worse, a framework that has made the distinction between truth and falsehood methodologically inoperative. And with that, it helps destroy the faculty of judgment. When you can no longer distinguish truth from falsehood, you can no longer make political judgments, including moral judgments about violence. And that violence, we are told, is simply anti-colonial violence. In other words, one gets to the point where flowing from the paradigm becomes the possibility that the most hideous forms of violence can travel in disguise as if they were anti-colonial resistance. Thank you.